What happens when you run out of weapons but not ideas? It's late 1944. Europe has turned into a grinding, brutal war of attrition where every day feels longer than the last. American squads huddle in shell-churned hedgerows while German armor pours forward like a steel tide. Fighter bombers are grounded by endless bad weather. Supply lines groan. The only plane that still flies the skies is the unarmed, lumbering C47 Sky Train, a slow, soft-skinned mule built to carry hope, not deliver it. And when hope becomes all you have, desperation becomes invention. Lives are literally counting on a gamble. On the ground, American soldiers are being hammered, waves of German tanks rolling in like a steel tide. Frontline positions are shredded, supply lines choked, and every hour brings another Panzer column that seems unstoppable. Morale frays, commanders scramble for any edge. And worse, there's no quick remedy from above. Air support is dwindling, leaving men to take the hits alone. To make matters worse, a ceiling of iron-gray clouds settled over the front. For days, the fighters stayed grounded, runways slick, pilots stranded, missions scrubbed, no close air support. No thunder overhead to chase the panzers back. Men on the ground were exposed, pinned under a silent sky. Only the slow, stubborn transports still managed the gaps, crawling through the weather like lifelines. The one constant in that gray, rain-choked sky was the C47 Sky Train, slow, stubborn, utterly unglamorous. It wasn't a fighter. It had no guns, no armor, nothing that looked like a weapon. It was a lifeline. Crates of rations, spare radios, blood on canvas litters, sometimes whole companies folded into its belly and dropped like desperate hopes. Pilots trusted its engines more than luck. Ground crews treated it like kin. It trudged through storms the fighters couldn't face, a lumbering workhorse carrying everything the front needed to keep breathing, proof that sometimes the most important tools aren't built for battle, they're built to endure. The C-47 was the workhorse of the sky. Reliable, stubborn, almost affectionate in its sameness, but make no mistake, it was slow, unarmored, and utterly defenseless. Built to haul cargo and people, not to take a punch, it lumbered over battlefields like a hospital train on wings, vulnerable to flak, fighters, and the snap of a Panzer shell. Its thin skin and sluggish speed made it more a flying target than a weapon, and every mission felt like threading a needle through enemy fire. For crews who knew the math, for soldiers who depended on it, the C-47 carried hope and a fragile, constant risk. Rain turns the airstrip into a slow-moving grave. Mud clings to boots, rivulets carve the taxiways, and every footstep sounds like a surrender. A handful of frontline engineers stand under a battered awning, faces streaked with oil and rain, watching through binoculars as Panzer treads tear through hedgerows and men vanish in clouds of smoke. Planes are grounded, radios cough static. They aren't arguing tactics or swapping jokes. They are doing what soldiers do when plans fail, counting the cost. Helplessness hangs heavier than the clouds. Every lost comrade presses on them like weight, and desperation begins to sharpen into a dangerous kind of focus. Rain plastered to their helmets, boots sinking in mud. The engineers watched another convoy get torn apart and felt hope drain away like the puddles under the airstrip lights. Planes were grounded, tanks kept coming, and the usual options had been exhausted. Then one of them, tired, wired, furious, blurts it out. What if we put a tank gun in a C-47? It lands in the hangar like a grenade. Obvious, stupid, brilliant. For a beat there's only the sound of rain and the distant thud of artillery. Faces shift from disbelief to a kind of feverish calculation. It's illegal, insane, and maybe the only thing left that might work. Nobody had signed off on it. The idea was unsanctioned, borderline insane. The kind of plan you whisper about over muddy boots and coffee when everything else has failed. They wanted to take a slow, defenseless flying taxi and brute force a 75mm tank gun into its belly. A flying artillery piece cobbled from wrecks and willpower. It meant bending rules, risking court-martials, and quite possibly tearing the plane apart the first time the cannon fired. And yet, when men on the ground are getting chewed up by Panzers, insane starts to sound a lot like necessity. Tension hangs thick in the hangar, so thick you could taste the oil and wet canvas. Pilots who've trusted their lives to fragile C47 seconds laugh, but it's the kind of laugh that starts in the throat and dies in the eye. "What, we're adding a cannon now?" One jokes, voice too bright. Another snorts, taps the plane's skin like it's glass. Their humor is armor for something colder, disbelief. Hands fold, eyes narrow. A sergeant mutters about paperwork that doesn't exist. Still, beneath the jibes and the scorn, you can see the tilt of choice, the desperate kind that makes men build miracles out of junk, and nobody can deny the single, older C47 being pointed at for the experiment. Doubt hangs in the hangar, jokes masking fear, but need drowns out caution they can't sit and watch men die. In a quiet, unofficial meeting, the brass looks the other way, and one tired, patched C47 is handed over, old, slow, and barely fit to fly. But all they get. It's not sanctioned. There are no blueprints, no logistics, no safety nets, only a ragged crew, a pile of spare metal, and a single, terrible permission. Go build something that shouldn't exist. They take the keys. They paint over the serial. There is no turning back. Under the dim, flickering hangar lights, the small team gets to work, driven by the urgency of the battle raging just miles away. Wrenches click, boots skid in oil and mud. Men move in practiced panic-pulling panels, unbolting seats, dragging out crates, every motion chiseled by necessity. There is no ceremony, only a brutal, focused hurry to make the impossible possible. They don't fiddle, they rip it out. Seats, stretchers, cargo nets, even the insulation behind the panels. Everything not vital to keep the C47 inches, the air is hauled away in a cold, urgent blur. Men pry loose bolts with block and tackle patience, toss ringed crates into the mud, and strip the floor down to bare ribs. Sparks jump when they cut through brackets. Hands shake from exhaustion and rain, but there's no time for hesitation. The plane becomes a hollow shell under the flickering lights, a cavern of empty metal being carved to a single, impossible purpose: to swallow the 75mm heart they're about to install. Now they have to clear the belly of the beast to fit the heart of their idea. A 75mm M4 cannon, the same gun that made Shermans feared on the ground. It's not a rifle. It's a hulking, heavy barrel with a recoil like a freight car and shells that weigh more than a man's pack. To shoehorn that into a slow, fabric-skinned C47 means cutting, welding, and redesigning every inch. Ammo racks, breech access, aiming arcs, all must be built around that brutal gun. It promises raw, tank-busting punch. It also guarantees a monster of a problem. Physics is waiting. Immediately, they face their central challenge: physics itself. The idea of stuffing a 75mm M4 tank gun into a fragile, fabric-skinned transport is thrilling on paper and terrifying in practice. One fired round would deliver a shock that could tear rivets free, snap control rods, and make the whole airframe leap like a struck beast. The blast could throw the center of gravity off, shred instruments, even rip the tail from the fuselage. In short, this wasn't just awkward engineering, it was survival. If they got it wrong, the plane and everyone inside would become a single, terrible scrap of metal. Fixing that meant more than clever welding. It meant battlefield ingenuity. They gamble on metal and muscle, turning the C-47 into a patchwork fortress with nothing but scavenged parts and willpower. Men in grease-streaked uniforms pry armor plates off wrecked half-tracks and smashed trucks, torching, hammering, and welding them into place along the fuselage until the plane's thin skin looks more like a tank's flank than a cargo hauler. Rivets are reforged, support beams doubled, and the cargo floor is braced with stolen girders. Sparks fly, the air tastes of burnt oil, and every strike of the hammer is a vote against defeat. It's crude, ugly genius enough to buy time, but not yet enough to tame the cannon's recoil. For that, they'll have to cannibalize a B-25's hydraulics next. They need more than plates. They need shock killers. So the crew hauls themselves out into the mud and strips the nearby wreck of a B-25 Mitchell, prying off hydraulic pumps, cylinders, and thick rubber hoses with crowbars and filthy hands. They cut, weld, and refit oleo struts into makeshift recoil dampers, fastening salvaged actuators to the C-47's frame, a brutal, hopeful patchwork meant to tame the cannon's vengeance. They jury-rig the salvaged parts into a crude but ruthless recoil system. Hydraulic dampers scavenged from the B-25 bolted to a welded cradle, armor plates gusseted into the fuselage, tensioned cables, and springy struts to spread the shock across the frame. It groans when tested, but holds. One problem solved. Another looms how to store and feed those 15-pound shells. Next, they tackle ammunition, a whole new nightmare. Each shell weighs 15 pounds, bulky and unforgiving, and they need a secure rack and a mechanical feed that can sling rounds into a cramped fuselage. There are no blueprints, no spare parts, just hand tools, scraps, and a deadline. How do you build a reliable loiter in the middle of a mud-soaked war zone? Armed with nothing but hand tools, raw steel, and a brutal kind of stubbornness, they cut, bend, and weld a feeding system out of scrap in the dim hangar light racks for 15-pound shells, a crude crank and rammer, springs and pawls scavenged and reshaped on the fly, testing catches with rope and grit until the mechanism fed reliably. It's rough, but it works, and the next battle will hinge on whether the wiring can be made to match. Then the electrical system turned into their worst enemy. They had to funnel a tank's firing circuit through a cargo plane that had never seen anything like it. Scavenged wire, bent relays, a jury-rigged firing switch wired back to the cockpit, every splice had to hold under vibration and recoil. One loose connection could either leave the cannon useless or send a surge through the airframe. Fingers moved like surgeons' hands, soldering, insulating, routing around fuel lines, building a crude safety interlock with whatever parts they could steal. Time was a predator. The sky beyond the hangar waited, and failure wasn't an option. The delicate work becomes a war of patience. Shorts and sparks shower the cabin, wires smoking, fuses popping as they try to snake the cannon's firing circuit back to the cockpit. Hands tremble, eyes sting. Every successful splice is followed by a new setback, dead batteries, fried relays, a singed panel, and each failure steals more strength. Still, they keep at it, stubborn and precise, until something finally holds. Night becomes a blur of metal and caffeine, hammers, wrenches, and a thin rain of sparks under a growling generator. They move fast, no ceremony, just purpose, hands raw, eyes rimmed with sleep, driven by desperation, cups of black coffee passed like contraband. Every short circuit, every curse, only sharpens them. They burn the hours, nerves taut against the coming dawn, shaping a plane into something else entirely. Hour by hour they strip and weld, grafting jagged plates where canvas once hung, bolting a Sherman gun to ribs that never meant to hold it. Ammo racks clank into place, hydraulic dampers are jury-rigged and wired back to the cockpit, rocket rails bolted beneath the wings. Sparks, profanity, stale coffee. This C-47 stops being a freight plane and begins to look like a flying tank as dawn thickens on the horizon. As the sun rose, they stepped back and took in what less than 12 frantic hours had produced. Hands raw, faces streaked with grease and rain, scavenged armor bolted where there had been cloth, cannibalized hydraulics grafted to a jury-rigged recoil mount, rewired circuits, and hand-forged mounts welded into place. The C-47 no longer looked like a gentle transport. It looked dangerous, deliberate, alive in a way cargo planes shouldn't be. It didn't just carry supplies anymore. It carried a new kind of firepower, born of desperation and pure, stubborn ingenuity. In less than 12 hours, a revolution in warfare had been built unauthorized, imperfect, and utterly game-changing. By dawn, the C-47 looked less like a transport and more like a field-forged war machine, a patched, reinforced nose cone of scavenged armor, a massive 75mm barrel jutting arrogantly from its side, and crude rocket rails bolted under oily wings. Weld scars and jury-rigged dampers peered through mud and drizzle. Inside, freshly cut ammo racks and a tangle of rewired firing leads disappeared into the flight deck. Men stood back, boots in the muck, staring at what they'd just made equal parts pride and terrified wonder. It was ugly, it was dangerous, it was brilliant. Even the base commander would be stunned. Even the base commander is stunned, a man who's dealt in orders and margins, now caught staring at a C-47 that looks more like a metal beast than the transport he approved. He'd signed off on a minor experiment, a desperate tweak to help boys in the mud, not a Frankenstein's monster with a tank cannon jutting from its side and armor patched like a junkyard trophy. For a long, heavy beat, he just stands there under the hangar light, part pride, part dread, thinking of regs, lives, and the thin line between genius and madness. Then he inhales, slams his fist into a glove, and lets necessity win. There's no time to argue, it must fly. There's no time for celebration. The base commander can only stare as the crew moves with grim, silent efficiency, last-minute checks, harnesses cinched, ammunition racks locked into place. Pilots strap in, breath measured. The jury-rigged cannon is live. No permission, no parade, just a single nod. They roll the patched-together C-47 toward the runway and send it up, right now. The overloaded, monstrous C-47 lumbers down the sodden runway, tires spitting mud, engines coughing under the extra weight. Pilots grip the yokes like lifelines, white knuckles, terse glances. The airframe groans and flexes, loose panels rattle. No one jokes. Only focused silence, a hand signal, and then, with a prayer and a violent shudder, the patched-together giant claws into the low, angry sky. At 2,000 feet they fell into formation, and the derelict truck on the airfield slid into the gun sight, an ugly, rusted silhouette on the ground. This was no practice. The cabin went quiet. The pilot's hand tapped the throttle. The gunner steadied his breath, fingers finding the improvised firing circuit. For a beat they hung there, suspended between invention and catastrophe. The moment of truth had arrived. The pilot gives the signal. Inside the cabin, everything tightens, shoulders, straps, breath. Hands hover over levers. The gunner cocks his head, eyes locked on the crude sight. Outside, the derelict truck hovers into place through rain-streaked glass. For a beat, time stretches thin and terrible. They brace for the violent unknown, for the first thunder they hope the plane can survive. A deafening, concussive roar shatters the cramped cabin, as the cannon shoves out its first shell. The C-47 convulses, metal screaming, instruments snapping, coffee cups flipping off the deck. Men grab rails. Dust and wiring flutter like ghost confetti. For a suspended, impossible second, the world tilts. Every joint and bolt seems to plead for mercy. But it holds together. For a beat, there's nothing but a ringing silence and the taste of adrenaline in every mouth as the fuselage settles and the metal stops groaning. Relief hits like a punch, hard, incredulous, immediate. Then laughter and curses spill out all at once. The pilots check gauges with shaking hands. The engineers who stayed up all night lean against the spar and laugh through tears. They trade surprised, dirty high fives and a single stunned nod. Their desperate calculations and scavenged parts hadn't been a suicide note, they'd been a solution. In that instant, the impossible feels real, and the whole crew knows they've proved the concept. Below, the derelict truck simply vanished in a ball of fire. A shockwave that threw up earth and sprayed metal high into the air. For a heartbeat, everyone forgot to breathe. Then the dust cleared, and all that remained was a smoking crater and twisted wreckage where a vehicle had been. The cannon's report hung in their ears like a promise kept. Against every calculation and every nervous joke, the converted C-47 had not only survived the blast, it had delivered its punch. In that single, awful, beautiful instant, the impossible idea stopped being theory and became a weapon. They stumbled out of the battered C-47 like men, waking from a nightmare, exhausted, buzzing, alive, the kind of tired that tastes like victory. Word spread before their boots hit the dirt. The weapon had worked. Pilots slapped shoulders, grinned through grime, and the frontline soldiers who'd watched their buddies fall cheered like it was Christmas. Someone laughed and named the thing on the spot, the Sky Reaper. The name stuck because it was honest, a slow, relentless predator that took lives from above and bought men on the ground time to breathe. They had hope again. Its true trial, however, was still to come. Its first real combat test came in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in January 1945, right in the teeth of the Battle of the Bulge. Winter swallowed the landscape, snow-packed trees, low gray skies, a silence so cold it felt like holding your breath. The Sky Reaper and its crew flew into that silence, not for supplies this time, but for blood, a desperate, unsanctioned experiment about to face its first true enemy. On the ground, tanks were hunting gaps in the line. In the air, an old transport now carried a single, terrible purpose. This was no longer a prototype. This was war. The mission is brutal and simple. Intercept and destroy a German armored column ripping toward our lines in the Ardennes. No finesse, only blunt force and timing. Captain Morgan's crew straps in, loads 15-pound shells, checks the jury-rigged recoil system, and plots an intercept to strike the convoy on the move. They plan to loiter, wait for the perfect shot, and stop the breakthrough. It sounds crazy on paper. A lumbering, unarmored transport is supposed to outfight tanks. But in the chaos of battle, that slow, steady pace becomes an advantage. Speed gives you one fleeting moment. Slowness gives you time to circle, to soberly line up a shot, to let a gunner track a moving target and correct for distance and wind. The C-47's mass and steady approach make its improvised cannon surprisingly accurate, and its endurance lets crews hang over a hot zone until the perfect shot presents itself. What looked like a weakness becomes the aircraft's hunting skill, patience turned into power. Fast fighters swoop, fire, and vanish one clean, fleeting strike. The Sky Reaper does something else. It loiters. Low and slow, engines a steady drone, it circles over the battlefield like a patient predator, watching routes, reading gaps, waiting for the perfect moment. From that margin of time and altitude, the crew can pick a target, set up a killing shot, and turn what looked like a weakness into a terrifying advantage. 2 hours more time than any fighter pilot could afford, and exactly what Captain Morgan needed. In the slow, lumbering C-47, endurance was an advantage. They could circle, watch, learn the enemy's pattern, and pick the exact moment to strike. The crew became hunters, not just aviators spotting the lead tank, timing the turret's rotation, waiting for the thin spot in its armor. They rehearsed the shot in silence, breath held, instruments checked, shells ready. Where speed robbed other pilots of options, the Sky Reaper's long loiter time turned caution into precision until it was time to dive into danger. They dropped through low clouds into a furious curtain of flak and tracer fire. Bullets snapped past the unarmored cockpit like angry wasps. The C-47 shudders, paint flaking from near misses. Inside, hands tighten on controls, breaths go shallow. For a moment, everything narrows to the hiss and flash outside. Then, the gunner fixes the crude sight on a Panzer. Against the thunder of flak and tracer light, the gunner ignored the danger and leveled the crude, handmade sight at the lead Panzer IV. His breath came short, knuckles white on the jury-rigged mount. The cabin narrowed to a single window of steel and crosshair. Captain Morgan held the crippled C-47 steady, counting the seconds, while down below the tank rolled into view. The gunner steadied his aim and flexed his finger over the firing switch. The gunner squeezes the trigger. They fire. A thunderclap rips the air as the 15-pound shell screams from the barrel, a white-hot tracer tearing toward the Panzer. Everything narrows to that single line of fire, wind and metal and fear. Then the shot slams into steel with a sick, metallic thunder, and for a heartbeat they wait to see if it held. It connects. The shell slams into the Panzer's flank, and the tank detonates in a towering fireball ammo racks, cooking off like a string of fireworks. Twisting steel, black smoke, men thrown clear or swallowed by flame. The convoy behind it freezes, radios choked with static. A road of wrecks and burning metal seals their fate, and the skies immediately answer with razor-sharp return fire. Flak rakes the Sky Reaper like angry hail. Metal screams as holes bite through wing and fuselage, skin peeled away in jagged, smoking tears. Alarms stutter, instruments flicker. The cockpit fills with grit and the bitter scent of cordite, while control surfaces judder under the impact. For a breathless moment, the whole aircraft feels like it might come apart. Then the crew clamps down and keeps flying. Bullets rip through aluminum, instruments sparking, but the crew didn't hesitate. They circled low, slowed to a predator's crawl, and picked targets with grim precision, one tank, then the next. The 75 millimeters barked, rounds punched through turrets, ammo cooked off, and steel erupted into fire. Tracks were shredded, lead vehicles immolated, the convoy ground to a haunted stop beneath a pall of smoke and twisted metal. The Sky Reaper ate hole after hole from ground fire and answered with another shell, relentless, damaged, leaking, but methodical, until the column lay in ruins. Smoke trailing, wings ragged and pocked with flak, the battered Sky Reaper limps home through a sky still streaked with tracer fire, a lumbering, smoking monument to improvisation. Inside, hands are greasy and trembling, instruments singed, and yet the grin on Captain Morgan's face is quiet and feral. It worked. The lead tanks are gone. The column stalled. Men on the ground, who minutes before faced annihilation, now look up and breathe. This crippled transport, jury-rigged in a muddy hangar, returned with its guns silent, but its message thunderously clear. Ad hoc, audacious, devastatingly effective. News travels fast from here. Word of the Sky Reaper's savage debut spread like wildfire across the front, whispered in muddy foxholes, blasted over crackling radios, scrawled on bulletin boards, and shouted down field telephones. Pilots swapped grinning, half-disbelieving stories in mess halls. Infantrymen pointed skyward and called it salvation. By the next dawn, requests poured in urgent, blunt, impossible to ignore from battalion commanders to corps-level staff. They wanted more planes that could sit over a fight and turn tanks into ashes. What started as a mad, one-off experiment was suddenly a demand storm, forcing logistics officers to ask a terrifying question: can we mass-produce desperate genius before the next armored column arrives? News of the Sky Reaper's success raced down the line, and suddenly the men who had been begging for any air support stopped asking and started ordering. Ground commanders, colonels, captains, sergeants were now explicitly demanding more of these flying guns to shield their troops. Radios crackled with urgent requests. Command posts lit up with frantic cables and stamped memos. They wanted loiter time, firepower, and coverage over choke points where Panthers and Panzers prowled. There was no bureaucratic patience left. Soldiers were dying. If it meant stripping transports and risking an experimental craft, they wanted Sky Reapers over their heads yesterday. Orders fly down the line, and C47 seconds vanish from the transport fleet, pulled, stripped, and shoved into a makeshift conversion queue overnight. Mechanics scavenge, weld, and bolt under floodlights. Pilots sign up for one-way experiments. Within hours, whole squadrons are reborn as gunships, a crude factory of desperation, answering the desperate cries from the front. What started as one hacked-together fighter quickly turned into a whole family of flying oddities, each crew putting its own spin on the Sky Reaper. Some bolted on twin 37mm cannons, mouths yawning like metal beasts. Others lined the fuselage with twin 50-caliber belts chattering down the sides. Loading systems, sights, and armor were all jury-rigged in the field, tuned by pilots who learned on the first firing. They traded techniques, swapped parts, and kept what worked. The result was a ragged, terrifying chorus of variants, each one imperfect, each one deadly, and one crew even tested a downward-firing cannon to strike tanks from above. Not content with side guns, one crew rigs a downward-firing cannon angled to punch through a tank's thin top armor. It's crude. It's dangerous. From above, the effect is immediate. One shell through the turret roof, and the crew inside are done. More than physics, it's psychology terror from the sky that can stop a convoy in its tracks. What started as one desperate idea in a muddy hangar changed everything. A cargo plane became a predator, and the sky became a new kind of battlefield. Soldiers who had begged for help suddenly had a slow, patient ally that could loiter over the fight, pick targets, and strike with tank-killing power. No run-and-gun passes, no fleeting chance, just deliberate, brutal support when the ground needed it most. Commanders who once planned fights around fixed doctrine were forced to rethink air power, tactics, and protection for advancing troops. In a few frantic hours, improvisation rewrote the playbook for close air support. After the guns fell silent and peace returned, there was no victory parade for the Sky Reapers, only pragmatism and paperwork. Without an official program to claim them, the field-made gunships were unmade, cannon barrels unbolted, armor plates stripped away, and the tired C47 seconds pressed back into mundane transport runs or quietly scrapped. No plaques were hung, no blueprints filed. What remains are scattered maintenance notes, a few grainy photographs, and the guarded stories of crews who swore to forget what they'd built. Bureaucracy prefers tidy programs to ugly miracles, so these airborne oddities slipped into the margins, barely documented and easily denied. They never made it into history books, no medals, no official reports, just quiet hangars where cannibalized parts were stacked and men who'd seen too much passed the story along over cigarettes and bad coffee. The gunships were stripped back to cargo planes, sketches and scribbled diagrams tucked into boots or folded into wallets, memories traded like contraband. Still, something stubborn lived on in those memories. The proof that necessity could rewrite the rules of war, that a cargo plane could become a predator if men were willing to break the mold. Ideas have a way of surviving when paperwork does not, and this one would not stay buried. 2 decades later, over the dark jungles of Vietnam, that same ragged idea came back to life as the AC-47 Puff the Magic Dragon, a slow, circling gunship that rained fire down, like the improvised Sky Reaper had once done over European mud. What began as scavenged armor, jury-rigged hydraulics, and sheer stubbornness had become doctrine, loitering firepower, precise, terrifying, and sustained. The AC-47 would evolve into the AC130 Spectre, a technological giant that traces its lineage to a desperate, unsanctioned experiment. The men who welded that first cannon into a C-47 may be forgotten, but the pattern they set still shapes modern air power. The names of the original engineers are lost to history, but by breaking the rules they wrote the first chapter of a new kind of warfare, proof that the future isn't always planned. Sometimes it's improvised. Their muddy, midnight jury rig birthed a machine that would vanish from the records, yet live on in steel and rumor, a direct ancestor to the AC-47 Puff the Magic Dragon, and decades later, the AC-130 Spectre. Small men with big ideas changed how wars were fought. They didn't patent it. They just did it. What modern marvels began as a desperate idea on a forgotten front line.